everyone. This is Stuart Marshall. I'm the potter here at Historic Bethabara Park. Today I'm in the 1782 Potter's House, and I'm going to do a pottery demonstration for you, tell you a little bit about the Moravian pottery here. And the first pottery shop here at Bethabara was built in 1755, and Gottfried Aust was the name of the first potter that came here. And he made a variety of pieces, everything from cookware, like this skillet right here. You can tell it has a hollow handle with 3 legs on it to place over coals for cooking. And more specialized pieces like this teapot, coffee pots as well. Most of what they made was very simple, jars and pots. Eventually they did make some more specialized pieces, even like this slipware plate right here, that they became sort of famous for in the surrounding area. And I'm going to show you about the first part of the process, which is throwing. Of course, you have to have a good source of clay, which the Moravians did find here. Along Monarchus Creek right over here, there's a good bed of clay. And you have to dig that and process it to get it ready for the throwing. And let me show you why it's called throwing. That's the beginning right there. It's to actually throw the clay onto the wheel. And this is called a kick wheel. You can see why. This is how we get it to spin, through kicking. And once it's going fast enough, you're going to get some water on that clay. This is a sea sponge. Get a little bit of water on there and start what's called sintering the clay. And it's just what it sounds like. It's trying to get that clay perfectly in the center of the wheel. And you can tell the harder I press on the clay, the more it slows down the wheel. And that first potter here, Gottfried Aust, he got here, he dug his clay, and he began to build his shop, which was closer to our Palisade Fort over there within it. And within months of setting up shop, he already had customers coming from all around, and eventually up to 100 miles away from Rod River in South Carolina. And the Moravians traded their pottery as far east as Charleston, South Carolina, and as far west as Fort Dobbs in North Carolina. And one of the reasons they were so successful is because North Carolina's population at the time, most people lived closer to the coast, so they could import their pottery. And when the Moravians built their town of Bethabara here, many of the people in this area did not have access to good pottery. And then when the Moravians set up shop, they found a variety of ceramics or pottery that they could use, everything from cooking to eating. And the Moravians even created smoking pipes, as well as shingles for roofs. I'm going to see if I can make a basic jug for you that would have been in high demand at the time for storing liquid. Of course, Bethabara had a very successful tavern here and a distillery, as well as a doctor. So the potter made all kinds of containers for storing medicine and other liquids. Gottfried Aust had quite a few apprentices throughout the years. And sometime in the 1760s, he had a young man named Rudolf Christ as an apprentice. And Christ, by the 1780s, became a potter here at Bethabara, and then later was the master potter at Salem. And some other apprentices here, some of them stayed within the Moravian towns, and other ones moved to places like Salisbury, to the south. And even some of them moved as far as Tennessee to set up their own pottery businesses. So after sintering, you're going to do pulling, which is just what it sounds like. It's pulling that clay up so that it's tall. You also want to do some collaring, which brings the clay back in, keeps it from getting too wide. And you can use, of course, your sponge and a variety of wooden tools. This is called a rib, which is used for shaping especially the side of the clay walls here. So once you've got the height that you want, you can start doing more shaping of the clay. And if I can, I'm going to take this wide mouth right here, try to make it more narrow so that we have a bottleneck at the top. Like that. It's a little rough around the edges, so we can use lots of different wooden tools to shape it up in the end. And then when we're ready, finish it off, make sure it's as narrow as we need so everything doesn't spill out. You can also use a sponge, smooth things out. You can tell the more I touch it, the more it's wanting to twist, so we can always just trim off the top. And use the rib for any final shaping. And maybe even add a few lines for decoration. And there we go. And now once we stop the wheel, let this dry out a bit till we get dry enough to where it's called leather hard, which means you could bend it sort of like you could leather. Then you would make a handle and attach that and make sure it dries without cracking. And then it's ready for firing in the kiln, which is like a big oven. And of course here they had a wood-fired kiln. And they were making what's called earthenware or redware, so it's not a really high temperature, but it's high enough to get the clay, of course, perfectly dry and then hardened. So that's a basic jug like the ones they might have made here. Now I'm going to show you a plate which the Moravian potters became known for, especially those designs, those slipware designs, that they continued to make into the 19th century, and ones that we still have surviving examples of. Whereas pieces like this, we have archaeological examples of that were excavated here on site at Thabra. We'll start with a fresh ball of clay here to make a plate. You're going to start the same way by throwing. Make sure that it's sticking to the wheel really well. And then kicking the wheel to get that momentum going again. The wheel we have here is a lot like the ones the Moravians would have used at the time. This is a metal wheel head. They probably would have had a wood one made out of a tree trunk. The base of the wheel is really heavy, so that once you kick it enough and once it's going fast, it keeps that momentum so that you don't have to constantly kick it. And the most you will kick it is getting it going fast enough for centering. After centering, you're not putting as much force into the clay, so you don't need to kick quite as much. So the pottery here stayed busy, and although the kiln was not that big, they did make a decent amount of pieces here. Sometimes when they would open up the shop after a fresh kiln firing, they might sell out by noon, and we know that from the Moravian records where they say people came from great distances and came here with the intention of buying pottery, but they couldn't because it was all sold out. So it was in very high demand. with a plate, I'm going to start by bringing the clay out instead of pulling up like we did with the cylinder earlier. And this clay is a little bit too wet. You can see I'm losing a bit of it as I pull out. But all of that can be recycled. Again, you can see the wheel slowing down the harder I press. And when the Moravians fired their pieces of pottery, they did 2 firings. The first one is called a bisque firing, and that basically dries out the clay and gets it hard enough. After that, they did a glaze firing, which is when they would take the bisque fired pieces and put glaze on it. And at the time, the glaze, of course, is the shiny stuff you see on the outside of the piece. And at the time, their glaze was made of 3 basic ingredients, and that was flint, silica, and lead. Now, silica is used in making glass, very similar to glass. Lead, of course, is a heavy metal that is toxic. And of course, they were making these glazes for a lot of their kitchenware. So we don't use lead glazes anymore, but that's what they found to be effective at the time. And we know eventually one of their sources for lead was Fort Dobbs. So they would take wagons of pottery to go to Fort Dobbs, and in exchange, they would get lead, which they use not only for pottery, but maybe especially for the glaze making. And they made really everything on scratch here, everything from digging the clay to making the glaze materials. So they would often trade for lead, but they would have to grind up those pieces and mix them together to make their own glazes. Now with this plate, once I have the bottom of that reasonably flat, you can use that rib and the sponge, flatten it out a little bit. And then I can start to make sort of the dish shape that they were known for. Because it wasn't a perfectly flat plate. It's something that you could eat maybe some roasted vegetables or maybe some stew out of. So I'm going to start by making that a little bit taller, almost like a bowl, almost like if I was making a bowl. Until it's tall enough. Then trim that outside a little bit. And once I've done that, get it just right. Then I can take this basic bowl shape and lay it flat a little bit. And there we have it. Basic plate, which then of course we allow to dry out. We might just put a plain glaze on it, or we might do a slip trail design like that one by using turkey feathers. Use the quill part of that with slip, which is basically a liquid clay like this almost. Then they would add in their glaze materials like copper for different colors. And then they would have a multicolored design like that one. That's about it. Thanks for watching.